So when God appoints humanity as his image, they are humanity. We collectively represent God to creation. We carry on his creative work. We're supposed to exercise stewardship over creation. So that's similar to bearing God's name, because that's also a representative role where the people of God are representing him. But here's the difference. Every human being is the image of God, but only the covenant people bear God's name. So I think that the two are similar, but it's as if God needed a people to bear his name because his image bearers didn't do their job. And so the role of the people who bear God's name is to restore the rest of humanity to their proper role and status in creation.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by another special guest, Dr. Carmen Imes. Welcome, Dr. Imes.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great to have you. I'm so excited to talk about your book and your research. But before we dive into that, just tell our audience a little bit about who you are.
I am currently serving as Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University. It's a brand new position for me here in Southern California. And I get to teach undergraduate students Old Testament all week long, and I absolutely love it.
Awesome. My good friend Craig is there. Have you met Craig? I'm sure.
Not yet.
Okay. He runs the apologetics program there at Biola. So
Okay.
we did. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, we have so many faculty. It's going to take me a while before I meet them all.
Yeah, our first apologetics conference was done in conjunction with Biola's apologetics
fantastic.
department. So
Nice.
And I just visited there like a couple months ago to see the chapel.
Oh, yeah.
So
Nice.
have some close connections to Biola. So I'm sure they're excited to have you there. You have a book called Bearing God's Name, and it focuses on a re-understanding of taking the Lord's name in vain. When people hear, do not take the Lord's name in vain, they think of swearing of some sort, but your research has yielded kind of a different view of that. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've thought through that and where you've landed on that subject?
Sure. Yeah. Here's the book for those who are watching, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. It is the fruit of my doctoral work. I wrote my dissertation on the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. And what I was working on was sort of chasing down a hunch that the ways that we've understood it are not actually what it means. And so most of us have thought of it as a prohibition against swearing, like using God's name as a swear word. But actually, my investigation convinced me that we've gotten it wrong, and that actually this command is speaking more broadly to the Israelites as the people who bear God's name. It's as if God has put his name on them, like tattooed them with this invisible tattoo saying, you are mine, you belong to me. And therefore, you need to represent me well among the nations. And so he's asking them not to bear his name in vain, in similar ways that we might think of, like a sports team is wearing their team jerseys. So let's say Biola's basketball team is going to go play an away game wearing Biola jerseys. And if they totally misbehave, if they trash talk the ref and the other team, and they ruin the what's it called? The room where people change, the dressing room, like the locker room. That's it.
Locker room.
I'm not an athlete. If they totally trash the locker room, and they're using bad language all the time, that is going to give people a bad taste in their mouth about Biola. It's going to misrepresent the school and everything that we stand for as a Christian institution. So in a similar way, God is telling the Israelites, the nations are watching you, and you are my representatives, so don't misrepresent me. So of course that would include the way we talk about him or the way we use his name in speaking it, but it's way bigger than that.
Mhm. That's helpful because as you're talking about that, I could only think of like how we're navigating. We do a series called "Why I Don't Go," where
Mhm.
we talk to young adults who left the church, and most of the
Yes.
reasons people leave the church are because people are are
Yeah.
not representing God correctly,
Yes.
and
Yes.
so he knew that this was gonna be a problem. That's why the commandment, as you're saying,
Mhm.
was initiated. Like, this is the reason why people don't, want to come to church. This is the reason why people don't
Yeah.
want to be associated with Christianity because of
Yeah.
the ways in which we represent God.
Yeah, that's such a great tie-in, and I think we are in a cultural moment in which the church's failures are being broadcasted far and wide. You don't
Mhm,
have to go even you can't even go a week without seeing a headline that talks about a Christian leader or a denomination that has failed to protect people from abuse, failed to handle funds well, failed to actually live by the moral standards that they proclaim from the pulpit. And so this is so important because you're right, people are walking away from God because of what they see in people and because of what they see in people who claim to belong to God, who claim to follow Jesus.
mhm. That's helpful because it shows, like, there's a deeper understanding when you just
Mhm.
think, I've heard, "Do not take the Lord's name in vain," and you're
Mhm.
like, oh, man, like, am I saying something where you
Mhm.
hit your foot and you're like, "Jesus Christ," or something like
Yep,
that, and you're
yep,
like, "Did I just take the Lord name in vain?" And it's
right.
like, it's way deeper
It
than that
is.
from
It
what
is, and
you're
if you think about the 10 commandments, this is right up near the top, like, right
Mhm,
after "No other gods," we have "Don't take my name in vain," and it's a little strange. It would have been a little strange for God to put such a small thing near the top as, like, "Don't say my name," as a curse word when you stub your toe.
mhm,
Like, it's way bigger than that. It has to do with representation. So, the way I see it is the first 2 commands, the command to not have other gods, not worship other gods, and the command not to take God's name in vain. Those are 2 sides of the covenant formula. I will be your God, and you will be my people.
mm,
There's an exclusive allegiance to God, and then there's supposed to be an exclusive, allegiance, like a as Michael Heiser would put it, a believing loyalty that your belief actually translates into action,
mhm,
and other people can tell you belong to God by the way that you live.
mhm. Yeah, that makes me think of "Be ye holy, for I'm holy." And
Yes.
that God is so distinct that when we
Yes.
behave in a holy manner, we become so distinct that we can only be
Mhm.
tied to a God that is holy.
Yes, absolutely. And that is the kind of repeated refrain throughout Leviticus, which is
Mhm,
focused on the holiness of God. And also in Deuteronomy, there's an interesting passage. Maybe I'll just read a moment from Deuteronomy 14. It says, "You are the children of Yahweh your God. Do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead, for you are a people holy to Yahweh your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, Yahweh has chosen you to be his treasured possession." And that idea of being holy then is tied with a particular practice that we don't understand really well, but this cutting yourselves or shaving the front of your heads would be making some kind of physical demonstration of a connection with the dead, or some kind of mourning practice that puts you in contact with the dead. And God says, no, you're my holy people, so when people look at you, they should be thinking about me. And I think this ties in with the high priest, because Israel's high priest actually wore a sign on his forehead that said, "Holy, belonging to Yahweh." And here, this passage says that what's true of the high priest is true of the whole nation of Israel. They are a people wholly belonging to Yahweh. And so that invisible name that they carry is supposed to work its way out into everything they do.
mhm. As we think of bearing God's name and, uh, us being created in the image of God, what when we hear, that we're made in the image of God, how do you understand what that means? Because
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important because we always say like the Imago Dei, we're creating the image of God when we're
Yep.
talking about different things or how people have been marginalized or thought less
Mm-hmm.
than human. And I always think like in this day, like when we say people are made in the image of God, I think we kind of conceptually as Christians kind of get it, but we're
Mm-hmm.
saying things that I don't think people really understand the
Mm-hmm.
weight of it. Can
Yes.
you just share with us what that means?
Absolutely. That's the question I've been asked probably more than any other since my book came out. People read about bearing God's name and they say, "Oh, that reminds me of being made in God's image. Are they the same thing? Is bearing God's name and being God's image the same thing?" And so I'm actually working on a prequel to this book that will be called Being God's Image.
Mm,
I'm a little behind schedule. Hope to finish it next summer. But here's in a nutshell what I think. The two concepts are similar in that both are representative roles. So when God appoints humanity as his image, they are humanity. We collectively represent God to creation. We carry on his creative work. We're supposed to exercise stewardship over creation, which means to maintain the conditions that make it possible for human flourishing, for animal flourishing, for plant flourishing, like that creation under our care would flourish. And so that's similar to bearing God's name because that's also a representative role where the people of God are representing him. But here's the difference. Every human being is the image of God, but only the covenant people bear God's name. So in
mm,
the Old Testament, that would be Israel. They're the people who bear God's name. And then in the New Testament, that is expanded to include all followers of Jesus, no matter their ethnic background. You don't have to be Jewish to bear God's name. And that's clear from Acts chapter 15. So, so I think that the two are similar, but it's as if God needed a people to bear his name because his image bearers didn't do their job. And so the
mm.
role of the people who bear God's name is to restore the rest of humanity to their proper role and status in creation.
That's so good and so helpful, a helpful distinction to think,
Mm,
of it in that way, that we all bear
mhm,
God's image, but we don't all
mhm.
bear God's name.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
is there
One
something
thing
you
that
wanna add?
Yeah, I just thinking of an illustration that might be helpful to people. I've heard people talk about that at the fall in Genesis, people lost the image of God or the image of God was damaged or destroyed. And I do not think that scripture teaches that. I think if you carefully look at the biblical text, the image of God is still intact. It doesn't go away after the fall. That's evident in Genesis 5 and in Genesis 9. Um, but I do think that maybe it's somewhat like if you have a child who rebels against you, that child is no longer rightly related with you. You might have a broken relationship, but they're still your child. Like
Mhm,
my daughter remains my daughter no matter what choices she makes, and no matter how often we talk to each other or how well we get along. There's nothing we can do to erase the kinship between us. That's just a fact of her birth. Um, so similarly, every human being is the image of God. Every human being has this intrinsic kinship with our creator that is meant to be expressed in a good relationship where we're carrying out the work that he's called us to do. But many humans are alienated from God. They're like a child who stopped talking to her parents.
mhm,
And so I think that's helpful. It's helpful because when I look around this world and I see people, it doesn't matter how they're living. It doesn't matter how moral they are or how intelligent they are or how kind they are. They are made in God's image. It doesn't matter whether they've committed a crime. Like every human being is made in God's image. And so I think that that should be the fuel behind our ethics, the way that
mhm.
we treat other people. Even just thinking of like criminal justice reform and police reform and all these things that are such urgent tasks today. Like for me, those need to be grounded in this understanding of every human being as the image of God. with inherent dignity and inherent relational kinship with Yahweh.
Mhm. That's extremely helpful. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
For many people, some of the most confounding aspects of the Bible is the Mosaic Law,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically how it applies to our modern context. Yet in your book, you seem to connect the law to the idea of mission. Can you,
Yes.
for our audience, explain a bit of how the law directly relates to the mission of God's people?
Yes, this is probably one of the number one biggest misunderstandings of the Old Testament that I've encountered. And that is this idea that, well, the Jews had to earn their salvation, so God gave them the law, and that's the way they earn their salvation. But Christians don't have to earn salvation. We get it free through Jesus by grace.
Mhm,
That is a huge misunderstanding of what's happening at Sinai. When God gives the law to Moses, the people have already been rescued from Egypt. He's already saved them, redeemed them. He's already said, "You are my people," and called
mhm,
them his treasured possession, kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Like that preceded the giving of the law. The law was a way for them to live out their new identity as the people of God. It was what their identity was, or how their identity was supposed to be expressed in every area of life. So the fact that they're a kingdom of priests, the fact that they're a holy nation means they need to treat their employees a certain way. They need to honor family structures in certain ways. They need to take care of the poor, and they need to treat foreigners in certain ways. Like all of the different specific laws are covering the various um, like domains of life, the various areas of life, and showing what does it look like to be a people who bear God's name in each of those areas.
mhm. That's so helpful. You briefly bring up an interesting phrase called liminal space, and
Mhm.
can you explain what that means and why it's relevant?
Sure. Yeah, this is a word that I learned in seminary, and I think I had to read it probably a dozen times and look it up a dozen times before it finally stuck. So it's one word that I want to teach readers, although the rest of the book I try not to use any vocabulary that the average person wouldn't know. But I think this one's helpful. So liminal space is related to the concept of liminality, which comes from a Latin word, limen, that means threshold. So if you can imagine a doorway, if you're standing right on the threshold of a building, like in the doorway, you're not inside and you're not outside. You're like right there in between. And
Mhm,
so scholars use the phrase liminal space or liminality to describe those phases of life where we're kind of in between different seasons, and where maybe our identity is undergoing some kind of transformation. So in the book, I talk about how God brings his people to the wilderness, and he keeps them there for quite a while because the wilderness is like his workshop. It's liminal space. They've left behind all of the structure, everything like life as they knew it in Egypt.
mhm,
Even though life in Egypt was horrible, at least they knew what to expect. And so you get some complaining in the wilderness because everything's become kind of undone for them. Like, who's in charge? Where do we find food? What are the rules? How does this all work? Are we there yet? Just all these
mhm,
frustrations that they experience in the wilderness are common to all of us who go through liminal seasons. And so what I try to bring out in the book is that God has work to do in us that can only be done in a state of dislocation. And that
mm,
liminal space is that place where he is remaking us. He's stripped away all of the things that maybe we relied on or we derived our identity from so that it can be regrounded in him. And when I wrote the book, it was before the pandemic. I had no idea that the entire world would be going through liminal space all at the same time.
mhm,
Everything that we knew about how to do life has shifted in significant ways over the past year and a half. And I think it's a tremendous time for the church and for Christians to be remade. Like maybe we've discovered that we've anchored our identity in the wrong things. And so this season of the pandemic has been one in which God is sort of shaving off our rough edges or smoothing those out and helping us to sort of recalibrate and remember whose we are.
Mhm. That's helpful and so true, and a good word for the space we're in now, where we're
Mm-hmm.
unlearning everything uh
Yeah.
that was in the season before the pandemic. And it's funny because
Yes.
we are in that space of like, what is it going to look like now? What
Yes.
can we do? Give us the
Yes.
setup.
Yep.
What are the new rules
Mm-hmm.
for how we do life? And
Mm-hmm.
that we're all frustrated
Yep.
about like
Absolutely.
the new rules and how they apply. And everybody wants to go back to before the pandemic,
Yep.
because you said even if it was we had our issues before, but at least we knew what it was like. So
We knew how to
like
navigate those
yeah.
issues.
So
Yeah.
like you said, the children of Israel, they were like, Egypt is horrible, but we know what to expect.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the new, you don't know what to expect because it's
Yeah.
new and you have to learn
Yeah.
that new space. So I think that's helpful in a way
Mm.
of framing like where people are. And I also
Mm-hmm.
love that you mentioned they were already saved
Mm.
when God gave them the law, because I don't
Yeah.
think we always recognize that. Like
Yep.
they're not working to get out of slavery. They've
Right.
already been they've already been freed, and
Yeah.
this is how to live as free people.
It was God's gracious gift to bring them out of slavery. He doesn't like show up at the border of Egypt and say, "All right, here's the deal. If you want to get out of here, you have to follow these 10 rules, and then I'll get you out." There's no prerequisites. They
Mhm,
just like he doesn't check to see if they have idols. Like the only thing that sets them apart from those who stay is the Passover celebration, where they just basically say, "Okay, I'm in," and they wipe the blood on their doorposts. That blood is a symbol that they're trusting that what God said is true and that he really has the power and he wants to bring them out. But it's not any kind of work on their part. They're
mhm,
not actually proving their morality before he saves them.
mhm. Yeah, and it's as we think about, like, what was the s as you're saying that, I'm like, "Well, what was the state of their morality when they were in Egypt
Mm,
that God has to give them?" Obviously, their morality post-salvation is different than their morality in Egypt, because if they had
yeah.
a God-centered morality, he wouldn't need to give them a
Mm-hmm.
layout of how they're supposed to live. So
Mm-hmm.
I never even thought about the fact that they could have been living very, uh, Egypt-like,
Yes, yeah.
for
They
lack of a better
were
phrase.
like all of us, they probably
Mhm,
absorbed the values of the empire and began to
mhm,
live by those. I can't remember the exact passage, but I think there's a place in Joshua where, I think it might be Joshua 5, where he's circumcising the people and they are celebrating the Passover before they fight any of the Canaanites. But I feel like either here or somewhere nearby, there's this injunction like put away the idols that your parents have worshipped. Like there's a sort of a house cleaning that happens. I don't see it in chapter 5, but it's somewhere in Joshua because I just read
mhm.
it.
No, that's helpful, because I think that in itself helps us to reframe
Mm,
how we think about salvation, Old and New Testament,
hmm.
because it's because I think there's this constant thing of God operated this way in the Old Testament and he operated this way in the New Testament. We're dealing
Hmm.
with two separate
Hmm.
gods.
Hmm.
And this is a reframing, like, no, he's always saved and then given instructions.
Absolutely.
He, while we were yet sinners, Christ died,
Yes.
pursuing us even in our wickedness, old and
Hmm.
new. And so I think that's helpful that you
Yeah.
shared that. Do you have
And
anything to
Lisa,
add
I
to that?
feel like, yeah, I just feel like this is kind of a persistent, perennial problem with Christians is we know we're supposed to like the whole Bible and we're supposed to read the whole Bible, and it's like the text that guides our faith, but most Christians just feel like they're all thumbs when it comes to the Old Testament. We don't know what to do with it. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is helping Christians discover God's grace and his mercy and his goodness on display in the Old Testament, because I think when we can understand that and capture that, we see that it's the same God in both testaments. In both testaments, God is taking sin seriously, and he's showing great mercy. And he knows when it's the right time to hold someone accountable and when it's the right time to be patient and give more time to repent. But it's the
Mhm.
same God. We don't have a contrast between Old and New Testaments.
Yeah, that's helpful. We just had Esau on to
Mm,
talk about navigating the Old Testament as a Christian.
nice.
And one of the things that he said that I thought was extremely helpful, he was like, when we think about the law is not just commands, it includes stories. It's
Hmm.
like the first 5 books of the Bible. It's narrative,
Hmm.
it's poetry.
Yep.
And we think of when we hear law, it's like commands. And it's like,
Hmm.
no, Genesis is part of the law. And it's like a whole
And
narrative of
yeah,
the beginning of the world. You
yeah.
were gonna say something?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought up Esau because he says something in his book, Reading While Black, that really grabbed me, and it was using the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel as kind of a metaphor for our wrestling with the biblical text. And Jacob would not let the angel go until he blessed him. And in the
Mhm,
same way, Esau says, I am going to keep wrestling with these hard texts in the Bible until they bless me.
mhm.
And sometimes Christians are just like, I don't know what to do with these texts. They're too difficult. But I think I've seen over and over again in my own life that when I press in and keep wrestling with it and keep asking, okay, how is God's character being shown in this passage? I feel like it's a weird passage or it's a hard passage or it seems objectionable. The more I learn about it, the more I sort of press in and refuse to let it go until I can see how is this the word of God? How is it inspired and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness? Then the text begins to come alive for me and I see, oh, I was looking at it from the wrong angle before, and that's how I was missing the grace of God.
Yes, that is so, I think, so helpful. We have an event that it'll be announced by the time this airs, but
Hmm.
January 20th, we're hosting Problematic Passages Part 2.
Oh.
I don't know
Hmm.
if you saw the first one with Joe Vitale and Esau McCauley.
Oh, great. No, I
But
didn't.
we had a Q&A where people could just send in all their questions
Hmm.
about the problematic passages in the
Hmm.
text around women, slavery, genocide,
Yep.
and people really enjoyed that. So we did that during the pandemic, but we're doing it in person in Chicago, January 20th.
Oh,
So save the
fantastic.
date. But what you're saying goes beautifully with that because the pressing into the hard things. And I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the ways we're going to engage people that may have left the church or left Christianity is to press into those hard spaces that they
Hmm.
thought were off limits and
Yep.
show them the richness of God's word in the Old
Hmm.
and New Testament. My
Yep.
favorite part of the Bible is the Old Testament. My favorite
Mm.
book of the Bible is Ezekiel, which is
Oh,
so
nice.
random.
That's great.
So I love the Old Testament and the richness of it. So I'm so happy
Mm.
that you're bringing that to bear
Mm.
in your book and in your work.
Mm.
Our final question for you is: what are some modern ways that Christians can better bear God's image?
Hmm. Yeah. So I think one of the first things is just like a shift in our thinking about how our faith is actually not private and individual, but it's public and corporate. So
Hmm.
we often, as Americans, think of ourselves as sort of an island. At least this is true in white communities. I don't know if it's also true of African American communities as much. I think there's more of a sense of community there. Um, but but we need to get away from this idea that like what I do is between me and God. What
Hmm.
I do is like nobody else's business because the Bible actually shows quite strikingly the what I do is everybody's business. And because I belong to God and that therefore serve as his representative among the nations, everything I do matters because I'm being watched and people are assessing God and Jesus and Christianity based on what they see from me. And so I just feel like it just raises the bar overall for our obedience, not because we're earning our salvation, but because we have the most important mission in all of history to carry out. I mean, when we think of this current moment, I think of social media and just engagement online as one area that we need to think more about. What does my voice say about the character of God? How does the way that I interact with people either draw people to the Lord or push them away? And we have a lot of loud voices right now. And I think a tendency in social media spaces to not treat people with dignity, but to sort of attack the person, to say things we would never say face to face to someone. And so I guess one area that we could really think about is, how am I bearing God's name in the public sphere when it comes to online engagement? And then, am I treating other people as if they are the image of God? And as if they are created by God and meant to steward creation on his behalf. Like, we've been drawn into a partnership. One of the most striking things to me about Genesis chapter 2, when God creates Adam and Eve, is that he gives them together the task of, actually at the end of chapter 1, to fill the earth and subdue it and to rule over creation. But never is there a command to rule over each other. And it seems like we've got this sort of, I don't know, our pastor on Sunday used the analogy of a rap battle, like trying to like talk up ourselves and talk down the other people to sort of assert ourselves. And I think it's just, we just really need to hang on to the truth that every human being is made in the image of God. And if I wouldn't say this to them face to face, then I shouldn't be saying it online. And if the spirit in which I'm speaking is fueled by fear or anger or mistrust rather than faith, hope, and love, then those are areas of my life that need to be refined.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I think that is so crucial in this current moment, when people
Mm-hmm.
talk about, but don't talk to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And God calls us to live holy, going back to our first part, and
Yeah.
distinct and set apart and countercultural.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't do things like the culture does it, or talk to people online like the culture does it. We have to
Mm-hmm.
be holy even in our social media engagement. So that is,
Yeah.
I think, a necessary word. Where can people get your book, Dr. Imes?
It's on Amazon or from whatever bookstore. You can order it from any bookstore. I also have a YouTube channel. It's been a little bit dormant while we've been moving from Canada to Southern California for this job. So hopefully I'll start up soon, releasing videos every Tuesday called Torah Tuesday that just help people engage with the biblical text. And I just want to share like cool things that I'm learning along the way. So
That's awesome. And your social media handles as well?
yeah, I'm on Facebook and Twitter. I'm pretty easy to find in both places, just Carmen Imes. And then I have a blog, and like I said, on YouTube as well. So Google me and it'll be easy to find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Imes, for joining us. This has been a rich
Yeah.
conversation.
Thank you,
Thank you
Lisa.
all for tuning in to another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, you can catch all our episodes at jude3project.org. You can subscribe on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Follow us on YouTube. We're on all social media at Jude 3 Project. We have a new series coming out, Why Don't Go Season 2. We have some cool events coming that you want to stay tuned to see. Remember, you can get merch, our curriculum, Through Eyes of Color. We have another curriculum coming out in a couple months, Courageous Conversations. So stay tuned for that. And you can watch Courageous Conversations on demand at all of those links are on our website at jude3project.org. There's a lot on there, so definitely check it out. Remember, also, before I forget, if you would like to become a monthly supporter, you can do so by going to jude3project.org. Every gift helps equip. And remember, here at the Jude 3 Project, we're helping you to know what you believe and why you believe it. Thank you for tuning in, and God bless.